good evening and welcome to the second installment of Unspent Court's Nighttime Lectures. Tonight's lecture will be on water and diffusion, which is the second half of section 2 in chapter 6. What are we going to talk about? Well, we're going to talk about diffusion, and we need to know how do we know diffusion was happening? Well, it started off with early observations made by a gentleman by the name of Robert Brown, who you see pictured here. Okay. And Robert Brown, actually, he was a Scottish scientist who was around in 1827, and he was observing pollen grains that he had suspended in water under a microscope. And what he saw was that these pollen grains had this constant motion. And so he decided, well, I need to see if this is true of everything that I put and suspend in water and look at under the microscope. So he took all sorts of stuff and he looked, whether they were living or non-living, to see if he saw the same thing, this constant motion. And lo and behold, it did. He did. So he ended up saying that there must be something to this, and he didn't know exactly what the explanation was, but of course, scientists being scientists, they credited him with identifying this motion. So it is now known as, that's right, you guessed it, Brownian motion. So, like I said, at the time, we didn't have an explanation for what Brownian motion was, but what Robert Brown didn't know was that he was actually observing evidence of this random motion of particles, and these particles could be atoms or molecules. And remember, Brownian motion is the random motion of particles, and like I said, particles can be gas or liquids or even solids. That's right, that solid that you're sitting in front of, that desk, is actually moving. It's just so imperceptibly slow that you can't tell that those particles are in motion. And that leads us to the idea of diffusion and how Brownian motion and diffusion are related. Well, because there is this random movement of particles, what ends up happening is these particles are going to move from one area to another. And we know now that this diffusion that's happening is when those particles move from an area where they have lots and lots of particles to an area that has fewer particles. And this tends to be a very, very slow process. So let's move. And we can see that there's some vocabulary that you need to know that goes along with diffusion. Of course, what's the vocabulary to know? Well, diffusion. And remember, diffusion, the definition of diffusion is the net movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Now, you have to say, well, what is concentration? Well, concentration, the definition of concentration, is the amount of substances that you find in a particular area. So, as you can see here, just follow the green laser pointer. You have all these particles right here, and this is an area of high concentration, and it's going to move to an area of low concentration. This always reminds me of an elevator, and think of an elevator that's completely packed with people, and somebody either smells really bad, or they have inadvertently put a lot of perfume on, or lo and behold, somebody had something for lunch and they released some gas. And so in this little confined space, we have all these scent molecules that are moving around this elevator, all these people. And this scent is just making people crazy until the doors open, and now the scent particles can actually leave the elevator, just like the people. And what happens? Well, they're all going to move from that area of high concentration, being trapped in that elevator like you see here, to an area of low concentration once those elevator doors open. Now, the image on the right-hand side is actually an image of random movement of nanoparticles in water. So as you can see, just follow the laser pointer here, you can see all these little particles just bumping and crashing into each other, and they will eventually move from areas of high concentration, again like you see here, to an area of low concentration. So moving right along, factors that actually affect the rates of diffusion. So there are three that we're going to talk about. The first one is concentration, and this is the primary controlling factor. And this is an external factor, so we can control what our concentration is. So the higher the concentration, the faster the rate of diffusion. The second factor that controls the rate of diffusion is actually temperature. And the higher the temperature, the faster the rate of diffusion. And I always like to think of this as, imagine yourself as a particle, and you and your friends are all these particles. You have just hit Big Beach, and you're walking on the sand, you've taken your slippers off, and you feel that the sand is hot. And what starts to happen? Well, you start to run from where the sand is really, really hot to where the sand is really, really cold, closer to the water, obviously. And so you're moving all around this huge beach, and you're trying to get away from that hot temperature, and so it causes you, the particles, to move faster. The last thing that you need to think about is pressure. Pressure is the last factor that affects diffusion that we're going to be discussing. And so as you increase pressure, as you make the space smaller and smaller, so imagine the walls are closing in on this area that you're in, a room that you're in. And so what happens is, as you try to move, you are bouncing back and forth against these walls that are getting closer and closer, and so it accelerates your motion. And when you accelerate the motion, you have a higher rate of diffusion. So I will show you an example of this tomorrow in class. I will do the temperature. I'll increase temperature on a particular substance, and you'll see how the rate of diffusion actually increases. The last thing that we need to talk about is diffusion in living systems. And so the reason we look at diffusion and we're concerned with it at all is because most of the time our cells in a living system have substances, and they're surrounded by water that contains all these substances, whether they're ions or molecules. And a lot of times what happens is those substances, by the time we take a look at them, they're distributed evenly. But before they're distributed evenly, they start off with having what we know as a concentration gradient. So the concentration gradient is actually what you start off when you first look at diffusion in a system. And what drives the diffusion is something known as dynamic equilibrium. So let's look at concentration gradient first, and you have to know the definition of concentration gradient, which is the difference in concentration of a substance across a space. And so if you look, I have an example here, and if you follow the laser pointer here, you have a lump of sugar that goes in, high concentration. Those sugar molecules start to move, and they diffuse away from the high concentration to an area of lower concentration here on the left-hand side of the beaker. And pretty soon it reaches this state where everything is still moving, but it has all spread out, and it's moving enough that if one of the particles from one side on the right side moves to an area on the left side, then that space will fill up with some other particle. And that is known as the concentration gradient. And I always like to think of concentration gradient in terms of color. And if you look, you have your really dark concentrated color here at the left end, and you eventually move to the right end. And so what's happening is you're losing your color particles, and so you're getting lighter and lighter in color. Again, here's your concentration. You're moving from an area where you have lots of color particles to an area where you have fewer color particles. And again, this shows you a gradient. Okay, and the reason this happens, again, the reason you have diffusion being driven forward is because you have what we call dynamic equilibrium. And so what is dynamic equilibrium? Well, the definition of dynamic equilibrium is a condition where you have continuous movement of particles, but you don't have an overall change. And again, you have to imagine in this particular example where you have the sugar, it's all distributed evenly, but these particles are always moving, okay? Now, why is diffusion important to biological systems? Well, this is how we get oxygen gas into our lung capillaries. It's also how we get a lot of our small molecules and water and ions into and out of cells. So diffusion actually drives this transport of some of these molecules into and out of cells and into and out of capillaries. So again, this is one of the reasons why we look at diffusion in biological systems, because it's a really important form of transport. Well, we have come to the end of our second evening lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope it wasn't too long. Sorry about it being a little bit late, but please make sure that you are ready to see that demonstration tomorrow. Thanks again. Signing out, Miss Bettencourt.